Awesome. So welcome, folks, to the YPPN. If you're catching up on this via YouTube, it's great to have you here. My name's Sam, and we have the fantastic Katie, who's here to talk about her Churchill Fellowship. She's going to talk us through some of the findings that she had, the reflections and journey that she went on, and pose some questions for us to think about and take away into the work that we do with young people as well. So those that are here in the room, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions of Katie, and I'll ask her at the end. And Katie might have some questions to throw to you as well. Katie, I'll hand over to you at this point, and yeah, you can start your timer.
Great. I do have a timer because it's very important to stay on track, isn't it? Let me just get back to gotta love a share screen. Hi everybody. While I'm doing this, my name is Katie Acheson. I am a very proud Victorian. I was born in Sale, Victoria in Gippsland, and I had my very first job as a youth worker at Wesley Mission in the Dandenong. So I just love this group of humans. You all represent some of my favorite and most dream jobs, really. Many of you have my dream jobs that I'd like to have. But today, let me stay on track and actually pay attention to what I'm supposed to be doing, which is always a fun thing for me. Now, can you see my presentation is the question? Thumbs up?
Yes, we can. That's great.
Yeah, great. I would like to kind of talk you through my journey as a Churchill Fellow. So I don't know if many of you know this, but the Churchill Fellowship is a fellowship. Every year they open it up. Basically, anybody who has a problem that they'd like to solve in Australia, they say, put a small application in, tell us about what you think the problem is, tell us why you need to learn from people overseas, and then we'll give you money to go overseas and do it. So I have for many years thought about it. I've talked to many young people who I mentor and many other people who I work with and said, you know, if you have a great idea, you should get a Churchill for that. And then I felt really convicted that I had not done that myself. And so I then went, okay, look, I'm really passionate about youth mental health. I'm really passionate about young people being involved in decision making. And I feel like as a worker, I have failed many a time to actually deliver what I wanted to do. So I went on a fail tour essentially to figure out sort of what is going on with young people and why I wasn't actually getting anywhere with the change that I wanted to see, because young people were telling us what was going on and yet nothing was changing. So here's an example of some of the work that I've done. So up the top, there's when I was the chair of AAC, which is the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition, our national peak for young people and children. And many a times we got in front of the right people. Young people were telling the decision makers exactly what needed to happen. And yet it didn't change. That top one is some of you might have been involved in when we tried to lower the voting age to 16. Young people had a really great campaign. They had really clear asks. It was really well supported. The media covered it. That's one of our senators, the younger senator at the time, Jordan Steele, and it didn't go anywhere. Then the next one is our budget. We had a budget where we saw a whole bunch of cuts to really great youth services, and it was just really hard for me to understand why this sort of stuff was happening when young people were really clear about what was working, and yet we saw funding cuts. And then the bottom one is our more recent one where a young person and I were presenting on the inquiry into the social media bans, and we went very hard about how young people should be involved in that room. And Abby was one of the only young people in that process at that time. And it was just, as an advocate, I was like, what am I doing wrong? So I got to Churchill and said, I just need to learn from what works. I wanted to find out how other countries, how other services were doing it well, and bring that cake essentially back to Australia. Like, here we go, everyone. This is what we need to do. This is where I've been failing. You know, it was really for me an opportunity to sit back and learn from people who were making a difference. So these are some of the organizations I met with when I went to the 5 countries. Originally, I had planned to go to the Middle East because for me, I feel like a lot of this sort of research that we get is very Western-centric. We see the academic research money going into countries where it's easier to do the research, it gets published. And so I wanted to see what was happening in places where the environment was different, where there was a really hard, challenging political space and still young people were getting really good decision making. So, but then there's this little thing called a war that happened, and the Churchill Fellowship decided that that was probably not a great place for me to go. So I very quickly rerouted and looked at some of the best work that was happening across Europe and in Canada. And it was, yes, it was great. So these are some of the great people. I would absolutely happy to talk to all of you or any of you at any time about these people and connect you with them. There's just such great work. But it was really interesting for me talking to them. And so I kind of want to just pause for a second and just see, because you all are running many of the best examples of youth services in Australia, and you, similar to those people that I met with, I probably have some great success stories. And I'm assuming that some of you may have fail stories like I do, where you tried to do something and it didn't work. But in your last group, so what I'd love to do is take this moment for in the chat is thinking about a project that you just ran, or maybe your whole service and work is focused on young people. So think about the last program that you ran. What outcomes were you trying to get from that project? So I've got some words up here. I've got fun twice because, you know, youth services, youth work, fun, fun, fun. What are the outcomes that are in this list? And feel free to add extra. Were you trying to achieve, like, that you knew this was, if I got this, this would be success for us? So we're just going to take a second, and if you could write in the chat. I'm just really curious as to what outcomes you're all looking at. Power shifting, great. Alana, system change, power shifting. Respite, great. So these were some of these words as you continue going on, and please feel free to continue as we're going. When I was thinking about those projects that I had run or been a part of, not only as a youth worker or as a social worker, but in my advocacy work, I often had tried to fit as many of these in as possible. And I think what I realized as I was listening to people is, this is just a nice little picture of me. Where you start matters. So as I was talking to people, what became really clear is simplicity of their recipe. So they were very clear about what they were trying to do with young people. In all of the positive success stories that I saw, they had a very clear objective, and they were super simple in the way that they communicated it. They were very consistent with the way that fed through at all levels. And I have to admit, I was really challenged because I felt confronted, to be honest, about the work I'd tried to do, because they put some really strict boundaries for the young people, for the organization, for the system that they were working with around what that project, what that organization, that group was able to do. And I felt like it was a limitation. Like, I really was a little bit judgy, if I'm honest, about, you just were trying to do one thing. That's like limiting young people's capacity. But then I had a conversation with a young person that shifted everything. And then I heard it time and time again when I talked to more young people across the 5 different countries that I went to, around the empowerment that happened through a very clear boundary. And what young people said is that where they started mattered to them. So there was examples across every program about how a young person felt like they knew exactly what they were signing up for, what their responsibilities were, and what their job was to achieve that. And it just kind of, a light bulb went off, and I thought about this recipe idea of when I was thinking about all the things I was trying to put into the bowl. It's a bit like thinking about baking a cake, and I put in flour, and then I'd put in chili and chocolate and a little bit of Tabasco sauce and soy sauce and all of the different things, because they're all really good in different recipes. And I would often try to put them all into the same thing. So when I was thinking about changing when we were working on lowering the voting age, for example, we wanted young people to have a voice. We wanted them to be part of systems change. We wanted them to be part of seeing visibly the power shifting. All of those things feel like they're the same thing, but they're just a little bit different. And then I wanted them to have fun. And we were talking about maybe we could use this for like resume building, and then they could get a job out of it. And so I kept on adding and adding and adding. And then I'd be surprised when I add a version of like a really flat pancake that didn't taste very good. And as a result, as I was going around in the Churchill and talking to these different organizations who'd done these incredible things, what I realized is they were really clear about where they started. So if they were making a pancake, they started with a very specific type of flour that would work for that. And then they told the recipe was very clear. So from that recipe metaphor, it was just like, they were like, we are about democracy, or we are focused on rights, or we're expertise, or even to the point where it was just a photo opportunity. They were really honest and clear with the for the about what your job is. You need to show up in this photo at this time on this day. It's going to do this. And they didn't try to make it anything else. They just said that. And as a result, they got all of these great outcomes from it. And I was like, so I was really challenged, but I found that there was a really clear objective for myself and my work. It's like, when I can be as clear as possible about what I'm trying to create, what is the thing, the cake, for example, for me, that I'm trying to make, and where do I start, and how do I make sure that I'm following that recipe? And I don't like boundaries. I don't like limitations. I don't like not being flexible. I don't do well with baking because it's very precise, and I want to be a little bit more creative than that. And that in itself had meant that my advocacy work specifically, or the work of engaging young people in real systems change and decision making, particularly for me, it wasn't delivering what I wanted it to, because I was adding way too many things in, and I was trying to do too much. And as a result, the young people didn't know what their role was. The systems didn't really allow for the change to happen. I wasn't looking for the right thing. So these were some of the areas where I was thinking the starting point really matters. And some of the key ingredients that I saw across all of the successful programs is that every recipe had very clear resourcing. So that doesn't always mean money. It means time, it means humans, it means space, it means access to rooms where it's really important. Where there was real shift in young people being part of decision making, it was really clearly articulated in the governance roles. So where a decision was being made, there was a decision-making framework, and young people were clearly in that framework at points, and they saw themselves, and the people who were part of governance saw them there. And some of them, the governance was young people, but even then, I'm sure some of you have seen where you have a young person, one chair in a board or a decision-making committee, and that young person is seen as all young people, and then they guard that chair really tightly. And I think it's about the clarity for me of like, what is that chair supposed to do? What is this process supposed to do? It was really clearly outlined and embedded throughout the process. The genuine power sharing, it was really awesome to see how some really large, even governments were putting young people across decision making, and they had very clearly showed where they had given up spaces. So we were just in the breakout room talking about even just the resourcing as young mayors giving $10,000. That's incredible because it's very clearly stating you have access and power over what, like, and giving them a budget. So things like that make a huge difference because the boundaries, the recipe is very clear. Training and mentorship, super important. Young people were very clear about what their role was, what the scope of that was. The system was aware of that too. And then there was training and mentorship to ensure that that was able to be delivered. So they were set up for success. They were allowed to fail. It was the training part was something I was really conflicted with. It was like, how often do I just put a young person into a situation and leave them there? Like, here you go and talk to the media and then back off. They'll be fine. Not giving them any of the supports that they need, not allowing the training for those spaces, and just assuming that they'll be fine, that everything will work out well. And then when the outcomes don't happen, I often would blame the system, blame the room. Sometimes young people get blamed. And actually, often I feel like for me, it was probably my lack of training with the young people. Diversity and accessibility, I think we talk about a lot, but it was a very clear ingredient where they had embedded it in the processes and in the way that they talked. And digital engagement, for all of you working with young people, you know this, but I think that it's something that's underutilized and under-resourced, and we often have a lot of fear in organizations about how that goes because of risk, but the successful groups had these sort of key ingredients. And just because I love a story, I want to talk about a particular recipe that I really love that has a translation. And this was a quote from a young person, which I think many of you probably would resonate with. Often there's an advisory role. We create a space for young people to look like they're being part of decision making, but actually the decisions have already been made before a young person even gets in the room. And that is not genuine. That becomes tokenistic, and we all feel very strongly about that. But it's an example of how that doesn't happen was 42nd Street in Manchester. And this is Simone Spray. She's an incredible CEO of a youth mental health organization in Manchester. And what I was really confronted with is that Simone, not only as a CEO had she set up a group or mechanisms for young people to feed into her role and her decision making, but she did it in a very interesting way. She had young people from support groups within the organization. She created a very clear process for the essentially the governance advisory group with young people, but she did it with young people with very complex mental health needs. So normally we look at vulnerabilities, we look at success measures, and often it's like the young people who are struggling the most in their everyday life, we create small versions of things because we feel like we don't want to set them up for failure. But instead, what 42nd Street and Simone did is that she created a very clear process for these young people to be part of the decision making that happens across the whole organization. And there were some really interesting things that she did. She had very clear role descriptions for the young people. She trained and supported them and had very clear structures. So she held them account like she would a worker, but she set them up in a way for success. They were very interesting how they supported these young people in some skill development, like conflict resolution and performance management. They would have hard conversations about where they were struggling to deliver on their role that they'd signed up for. And the whole group were able to have really hard conversations with each other. It was incredible, the skill development that they created through that. But the purpose of it was very clear. They were signing up for being part of the decision-making process in the organization, and she set them up for success. The mechanisms and measures were really clear to the young people, to the workers, to the organization, and to the funders. And that transparency was key, because young people felt ownership over the deliverables, which is something I would not always do. But I saw how successful it was, and I talked to some young people who were really struggling with their mental health at the time, and yet clearly articulating at the same time their role and the empowerment that happened through being part of that process and feeling ownership of that. The ability to fail and learn, I think, was great. They didn't just get kicked out when something didn't work or when they wanted to leave, or when they were, struggling with what was happening for them and their challenges at the time. There was very clear abilities for them to be able to be honest, but also to come back to the role and to be transparent in a way that was safe for them. Oh, that's my time, so I will give me 2 more seconds. There was very genuine commitment to power sharing, and they had time to adapt. And I think to take it away from there, and I will maybe stop sharing my screen. I think for me as a youth worker, I would encourage you, as I felt it was an opportunity for me in those 6 weeks, is sometimes we have the best intentions. Sometimes we have young people who we think are perfect for what we need to do, and it doesn't go well. And like, how often do we allow ourselves to really consider, did I set this up in the right way? Have I really been listening to young people as I should have? Did I put the resources in that I could have? And allowing myself to fail. I often just didn't. I couldn't. I was like, we've got to get to the next thing, because young people, there's some pretty serious systems that bring some really complex situations and sometimes oppression and pressure on young people. And we want to fix it immediately, but we don't create a space for learning. And I think when I've come back, I'm really passionate to share with my fellow youth workers is, how can we shift what is not working? And for me, my big learning is I was trying to do too much, and I wasn't being honest with young people. And sometimes the power sharing is talking about the limitations of the power and not promising the world, but being really truthful, and then inviting a young person to make a decision based on what they know to be in front of them, and allowing them that decision genuinely. Like, this is only going to be a photo opportunity, but do you want to be involved? Here's what it might produce, but this is what the outcome that I can give you. There's one thing. And so from now on, my big passion is like, where are you starting? Start with one thing. Can you be transparent? Can you have some of those key ingredients? And you'd be surprised how many things. The 42nd Street have an incredible example of all the great outcomes that come out for those young people. But they are very clear about their job. I have to be part of the process of governance of this organization. They know that that's their job. Whether they get skills from it, whether they meet friends, whether their mental health improves, whether they engage in a different way, whether they feel empowered or resilient, or any of those things are side outcomes for them. But what they really know and they feel really responsible for, and why they are so successful, is because they know what their job is and they deliver that. So for me, that's the question I always ask myself. Are the young people I'm involved with, do they know what's being asked of them, and will they take that feeling of success at the end if they achieve that?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. And yeah, folks, if you haven't downloaded and read the report, I would really urge you to do that. Like, it's written in a really just a really interesting way, in an accessible way, because it talks through concepts and ideas and then breaks them down into components and gives case studies and gives recommendations. So it kind of is continually reflective and inspiring at the same time. So if you haven't engaged with the actual report itself, I really would, because the way Katie's reflected it here has drilled down into one thing that she wants to try and focus on today. I see what you've done there, Katie. But the actual report is really quite broad and can speak to your kind of contexts and your goals and potential outcomes in very different ways. One thing, Katie, the chat has been going off. People have been really reflecting on their own work, but also about bigger concepts of youth participation and particularly about decision making and systems change. One question I did pick up was Ruby's popped in the chat. Would love to know more about what a commitment to power sharing looks like in practice. And I wonder, is there anything that comes to mind for you around that? I don't know if Ruby was specifically asking you. It looks a little bit more like a reflection, but I'm wondering maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yes, so many examples. The Council for Europe has the Council of Youth, which is probably the most interesting. Now it has some there's lots of thoughts about it, but it is one of the most interesting government versions where 30 young people and 30 ministers from countries around the European Union have equal voting rights. So it was very clearly set up. And one of the hugest lessons I learned from that was the embedding of the structures to create the power sharing. They're very, very strict on, it's a consent model. Everybody has to agree. Everybody gets equal votes. There's very clear rules, which is really strange for me, for young people to really embrace it. But it is about a very structured. So where I've seen the highest level of power sharing with young people, it was highly structured, and the bureaucrats who worked in it were the most skilled, highly trained bureaucrats I've ever seen working with a youth program. Because often what happens is when there's a youth program or funding group, they get young bureaucrats or bureaucrats with who are more junior, and the senior people are with the Prime Minister, whereas this was a reverse, is that the people who ran this had come from the version of a Premier's office. So it was incredible to see how invested they were. So the power sharing, the genuine power sharing where power is really big, needs really big structures and really big resourcing. But I have versions of that throughout local councils and services that are useful, but that was the most interesting one. And the key ingredient, I think, was the structure, and particularly the skilled bureaucrats. I was shocked.
Yeah, fascinating. And because I think many of us try to break down bureaucracy a lot of the time and create environments that are a little bit more informal, that maybe that try and remove some of the layers of your bureaucracy and decision making. But that's a really interesting take on how actually to embed it within a bureaucratic environment, you sort of maybe need to embrace that and actually have it really clearly structured.
Yeah, I think we make assumptions about young people's capacity and also the capacity of systems to work with young people. And as a result, we create tokenism by creating subsection things that don't feel real because we created it to make it what we think is more appropriate. And it's like, actually, if we want to change the big systems, sometimes you have to be in that system. How can we help that system to work with young people? And that means adapting to some of the stuff that we feel comfortable with. But that's where really great collaborations with really smart bureaucrats make all the difference.
Yeah. Wow. Zoraika has also put in the chat, if you could give the decision makers one key message about getting young people involved or heard, what would you say?
You are about to be obsolete. So you probably should learn from the expertise of the people who are across what is happening in the world. And that, I think I just cannot say it enough times, is that the generational divide, the stress and anxiety, all of those things, young people are right in the midst of it. They are literally the experts who understand the digital space. They understand youth mental health. They understand access. They really understand the systems that are not working. So that expertise being locked out of the room means your decision-making becomes very quickly obsolete. And you would never do that when you were planning success. You would never plan for something failing, and yet by leaving young people out and their expertise out of the room, you are setting yourself up for failure.
I love that. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. I think we might wrap it up there just based on time, but I know that we could go and go and go on this. And how do people stay in touch with you after today? Is there a way people can reach out to you
Yes,
or, yeah,
please. Beck will put my email in. You please email me at all times. If I don't know the answer, I will figure it out. I'll also really connected across the world, super fascinated and interested in everything that everyone's doing, and just love to be supportive. So if you have a question, you want to bounce around, you want some support, Numbers and People Synergy that I started with a friend of mine, we do sort of global work with data and young people and youth advocacy sort of space. But I'm always happy to just have a chit chat and support you anyway, because I'm pretty much obsessed with all your work.
love that. Thank you. I'm going to stop recording now. If you're watching along on YouTube, check out the YPPN on yakvic.org.au/YPPN.